The moment Diane Prescott handed me a $500 fine for building on my own land was the moment I realized I'd been underestimating my entire life. She called my cabin an unauthorized structure. What she didn't know was that my family's deed to this property is older than her entire neighborhood, by 44 years. And I had every document to prove it. If you're watching this while pretending to read HOA bylaws so your board president stops glaring at you, drop a comment and tell me where you're hiding. I promise this story is worth your time. My name is Jonathan King. I'm a carpenter, 4th generation on this land. And 2 months ago, a woman who moved here in 2005 tried to tell me I didn't have the right to build where my great-grandfather planted his roots in 1943. She was wrong, and she's about to find out exactly how wrong. The smell of fresh-cut oak filled the air as I secured the last roof beam into place. Late afternoon sun slanted through the frame, casting long shadows across the foundation my great-grandfather had laid down 79 years ago. This cabin, 400 square feet of honest craftsmanship, had sheltered 4 generations of kings. The original structure had finally given up last winter, rotted through after decades of Carolina weather. I wasn't building something new. I was rebuilding what had always been here, on the same footprint, using the same techniques Samuel King had taught my grandfather, who taught my father, who taught me. Every nail I drove felt like a conversation with men I never met but somehow knew. I heard the car before I saw it. A black SUV rolling down the gravel path that cut through the edge of Sycamore Glen, the subdivision that had grown up around my family's land like weeds around an old tree. The vehicle stopped just short of my property line, and 2 people stepped out with the kind of purpose that told me this wasn't a social visit. The woman wore a navy blazer despite the heat, clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield. The man beside her carried a camera, already snapping photos of my half-finished cabin before his feet touched the ground. They positioned themselves at the exact boundary between my land and the HOA's territory, careful not to cross over, but making sure I knew they were watching. The woman called out first, her voice sharp enough to cut through the sound of my work. "Sir, are you aware that you are constructing an unauthorized structure?" I set down my hammer and wiped sawdust from my hair, taking my time. She was maybe late 50s, blonde hair pulled back tight, the kind of posture that suggested she was used to people jumping when she spoke. I climbed down from the scaffolding and walked toward them slowly, giving myself space to think. "I'm Jonathan King," I said when I reached a comfortable distance. "This is my property. Can I help you with something?" The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Diane Prescott, president of the Sycamore Glen Homeowners Association. This is Gerald Finch, our compliance officer." She gestured toward the cabin frame behind me. "All construction within our community requires prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee. We have no record of any application from you." I felt something tighten in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. "This land has been in my family since 1943. It's not part of your community." Diane tilted her head slightly, the way someone does when they're about to explain something to a child. "Mr. King, your property falls within the geographic boundaries of Sycamore Glen. All properties within these boundaries are subject to HOA governance. That's simply how it works." She extended the clipboard toward me. "This is a citation for unauthorized construction, $500. You'll need to cease all work immediately until you've submitted proper applications and received approval from the board." I looked at the paper, but didn't take it. "And if I don't," Gerald stepped forward, camera still in hand, "failure to comply may result in additional fines, liens against your property, and potential legal action. The HOA takes community standards very seriously. Mr. King." Diane placed the citation on a nearby sawhorse when I refused to accept it directly. "I'd encourage you to review our covenants. They're available on the community website. We hold monthly meetings on the first Tuesday. You're welcome to attend and discuss your concerns through proper channels." Her tone made it clear that proper channels meant agreeing to whatever she decided. They walked back to their SUV without waiting for my response, Gerald pausing to take a few more photos of my property before climbing in. I watched them drive away, the black vehicle disappearing into the rows of identical houses that surrounded my 3 acres like a siege. The citation sat on the sawhorse, edges fluttering in the breeze. I picked it up and read it carefully. Official letterhead, HOA logo embossed at the top, language designed to intimidate, violation, non-compliance, Enforcement action. $500 for building on land my family had owned before any of these people were born. I folded the paper and slipped it into my back pocket, then stood looking at the cabin frame as the sun dropped lower. My father passed 2 years ago, before him. My grandfather in '98. The cabin had outlived them all, barely, and I'd made a promise to keep it standing for the next generation. Now a woman who'd probably never held a hammer in her life was telling me I needed her permission to honor that promise. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table in my main house with a metal lockbox that had belonged to my grandfather. Inside were documents yellow with age, organized in folders my grandmother had labeled in her careful handwriting decades ago. The deed was there, right where I remembered, dated March 15th, 1943, recording the sale of 3 acres from William Tate to Samuel King. No covenants attached, no restrictions, no mention of any homeowners association, because none had existed for another 44 years. I found something else too. Tucked between tax records from the '80s, a handwritten note in my great-grandfather's script. Sycamore Development offered $50,000 for the land. Told them no. This ground isn't for sale. Not now. Not ever. Whoever reads this next, remember that. The note was dated 1985, 2 years before Sycamore Glen broke ground on its first house. I set the note aside and looked out the window at the cabin frame silhouetted against the darkening sky. Diane Prescott thought she could push me around because I was one man against her entire organization. She didn't know about the deed. She didn't know about my great-grandfather's refusal. And she clearly didn't understand that the Kings had been protecting this land since before her precious neighborhood was anything more than a developer's fantasy. I pulled out my phone and searched for property attorneys in the Raleigh area. If she wanted a fight about paperwork, I'd give her one. But I was going to make sure I had the right paperwork first. The Wake County Register of Deeds office opened at 8:30 the next morning. I was there at 8:15, coffee in hand, folder of documents tucked under my arm. The clerk who helped me was a patient woman in her 60s who seemed genuinely interested when I explained what I was looking for. She pulled up the digital records first, then disappeared into the archives for the original paper files. 30 minutes later, I was staring at my family's history spread across a wooden table in the back room. The deed from 1943 was exactly as I remembered Samuel King purchasing 3 acres from William Tate for $1,200, recorded and stamped by the county on March 15th. But what mattered more was what wasn't there. No restrictive covenants, no easements, no mention of any homeowners association or community governance. The land had been sold free and clear, and it had stayed that way through 4 generations of ownership. I asked the clerk to pull the formation documents for Sycamore Glen HOA. She returned with a much thinner file dated 1987, 44 years after my great-grandfather's purchase. The incorporation papers listed Sycamore Development Corporation as the founding entity, with an initial coverage area that included approximately 200 acres of former farmland. I studied the boundary maps carefully, tracing the lines with my finger. The HOA's territory wrapped around my family's property like a horseshoe, bordering us on 3 sides but never crossing into our 3 acres. The developer had drawn those lines deliberately. They had known exactly where King's land ended, and their jurisdiction began. Somewhere between 1987 and today, that knowledge had been conveniently forgotten. Here's something most people don't understand about homeowners associations. An HOA only has authority over properties that are legally bound to its covenants. This binding typically happens in one of 2 ways. Either the property was part of the original development, and the covenants were attached to the deed at the time of sale, or a property owner voluntarily signed an annexation agreement to join the association later. If neither of those things happened, the HOA has no more legal power over your land than a random stranger on the street. My property predated the HOA by 4 decades. No king had ever signed any agreement. On paper, Diane Prescott had exactly 0 authority to fine me for anything. The question that kept circling in my mind was simple. How had they gotten away with this for so long? I drove back home and spent the afternoon digging through the lockbox more thoroughly. That's when I found the answer. And it wasn't one I was proud of. Buried in a stack of old bank statements was a series of canceled checks from my father, dating back to the early 2000s. $25 here, $50 there, small fines for things like unapproved exterior modifications, and vegetation non-compliance. My father had been a quiet man who hated conflict. He'd probably just paid these nuisance fees to make them go away, never realizing what he was implying. I could almost hear Diane Prescott's argument forming. The King family has been paying HOA fines for years. That constitutes acceptance of our jurisdiction. I called a property attorney named Ralph Hughes that evening. His office was in downtown Raleigh, and according to his website, he specialized in exactly this kind of dispute. He answered on the third ring with a voice that sounded like he'd spent decades arguing in courtrooms. I gave him the short version: family land since '43. HOA formed in '87. No covenants ever attached. But now they were fining me for rebuilding a cabin that had stood on the property for almost 80 years. He listened without interrupting, then asked the question I'd been dreading. Did anyone in your family ever pay fines to this HOA? I told him about my father's checks. There was a pause. That complicates things slightly, but it's not fatal. Payment of fines without a signed agreement doesn't automatically create jurisdiction. It just means they'll try to argue implied consent. We can beat that argument if your documentation is solid. He told me to bring everything to his office the next morning. That night, I sat on the porch of my main house with the lockbox open beside me and my laptop balanced on my knees. I was searching through county records online, trying to piece together the full timeline. Sycamore Development Corporation had filed for bankruptcy in 1992, just 5 years after completing the neighborhood. The HOA had been transferred to a resident-managed board, which Diane Prescott had eventually taken control of in 2016. 8 years of her running things. 8 years of her sending letters and collecting fines and acting like she owned every blade of grass in a 5-mile radius. I pulled up the HOA's current website and found the page listing board members. Diane's bio described her as a retired real estate professional dedicated to maintaining community excellence. Nothing about her gave any indication that she understood or cared about the legal limits of her authority. The cabin frame stood silent in the moonlight, waiting for me to finish what I'd started. I thought about my great-grandfather turning down $50,000 in 1985. That was real money back then, enough to change someone's life. But he'd said no. He'd written that note about the land not being for sale and tucked it away for someone like me to find decades later. Samuel King had drawn a line in the dirt and dared the developers to cross it. They hadn't. But the woman who came after them was a different kind of problem. She wasn't trying to buy the land. She was trying to take control of it through bureaucracy, one fine at a time, counting on people like my father to pay up and shut up. That strategy had worked for years. It wasn't going to work anymore. I closed the laptop, gathered the documents, and went inside to get some sleep. Tomorrow I will meet Ralph Hughes. Tomorrow I would start building a case as carefully as I'd been building that cabin. And when it was finished, Diane Prescott was going to learn that some boundaries can't be moved by paperwork alone. Ralph Hughes' office was on the 3rd floor of a brick building downtown, the kind of place that smelled like old leather and coffee that had been sitting too long. He was a tall man in his mid-40s with graying temples and the calm demeanor of someone who had seen enough legal battles to know which ones were worth fighting. I spread my documents across his desk, the original deed, the county records, the HOA formation papers, my father's canceled checks, and the handwritten note from my great-grandfather. Ralph examined each one methodically, occasionally jotting something on a yellow legal pad. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Mr. King, you have a solid case, he said. Your deed predates the HOA by 44 years. There's no covenant attached, no annexation agreement, and the original boundary maps clearly exclude your property from the development. Legally speaking, the Sycamore Glen HOA has no jurisdiction over your land. I felt something loosen in my chest. So, the fine is invalid, Ralph nodded. The fine is invalid. Every fine they have ever sent to your property was invalid. But here's where it gets complicated. He pulled up the canceled checks my father had written. These payments create a paper trail they'll try to use against you. They'll argue implied consent that your family accepted HOA authority by paying fines over the years. It's a weak argument, but it's the only card they have, and they'll play it hard. He stood and walked to the window, hands in his pockets. You have two options. Option A, we send a cease and desist letter immediately. We inform the HOA that your property is not under their jurisdiction, demand they withdraw all fines, and put them on notice that any further action will result in legal consequences. This is the aggressive approach. It forces their hand. He turned to face me. Option B, you say nothing. You continue building your cabin, you ignore their citations, and you wait to see if they actually follow through with a lien or lawsuit. If they do, we respond then with overwhelming evidence. This is the defensive approach. It gives them rope to hang themselves, but it also means living with uncertainty for months. I stared at the documents on his desk. Both options had risks. The aggressive approach would make me a target. Diane Prescott didn't strike me as someone who backed down gracefully when challenged. If I sent that letter, I was declaring war on a woman who had controlled this neighborhood for 8 years, who had the entire board in her pocket, and who clearly enjoyed wielding power over people who couldn't fight back. But the defensive approach meant watching and waiting while she continued her campaign. It meant more fines showing up in my mailbox, more photos being taken of my property, and more uncertainty about whether I could finish the cabin without ending up in court. My father had chosen the quiet path. He'd paid the fines and avoided conflict, and all it had done was embolden them. "What would you do?" I asked. Ralph gave me a slight smile. "I'd send the letter, but I'm a lawyer. I get paid either way. This isn't my land, it's not my family history. The question you need to answer is what you're willing to risk to protect it." I thought about Samuel King standing on this same ground in 1985, a developer waving $50,000 in his face. He could have taken the money and walked away comfortably. Instead, he'd written a note about the land not being for sale and tucked it away for his great-grandson to find 4 decades later. He hadn't played defense. He'd drawn a line and held it. The cabin I was building wasn't just lumber and nails. It was a promise I'd made to men who weren't alive to see me keep it. Let me stop here for a moment. Jonathan has 2 choices. Send the letter and risk an all-out war with an HOA president who doesn't like being challenged, or stay silent, keep building, and hope she loses interest before she files a lien. There's no safe path. Both roads lead through fire. If this were your land, your family's legacy, what would you choose, the sword or the shield? Think about it, because Jonathan's about to make a decision he can't take back. I'm Michael Vincent, your storyteller today on Fallout HOA. If you were in this situation, what would you do? Leave a comment below and let's see whose solution is the best. Thank you all. I looked at Ralph. Send the letter. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. I'll have it drafted by the end of the day. We'll send it certified mail with a return receipt, so there's no question they received it. I'll also include copies of the key documents, your deed, the boundary maps, and the formation papers. We want them to know exactly what they're dealing with before they make their next move. He started making notes. One more thing, Mr. King, when this letter arrives, Diane Prescott is going to be angry. She's been running that HOA unchallenged for years. People like that don't respond well to being told they're wrong. Expect some kind of escalation. Don't engage emotionally. Document everything. And call me immediately if they contact you directly or show up at your property again. I drove home with the windows down, letting the warm Carolina air wash over me. The cabin frame was visible from the road now, rising above the tree line like a statement of intent. I parked and walked the property boundary, looking at the houses of Sycamore Glen that surrounded my land on 3 sides. Families lived there. Kids played in those yards. Most of them probably had no idea that their HOA president was harassing a neighbor over land she had no legal claim to. They just paid their dues and followed the rules and trusted that someone in charge knew what they were doing. That trust was about to be tested. 3 days later, Ralph called to confirm the letter had been delivered. Diane Prescott had signed for it personally. The ball was in her court now. I went back to work on the cabin, measuring and cutting and fitting boards into place. The way my grandfather had taught me, every joint is precise, every nail driven true. I wasn't building fast, I was building right. And somewhere across the neighborhood, a woman who had never held a hammer was reading a letter that told her she'd been wrong for 8 years. I wondered how long it would take her to respond. I didn't have to wonder long. The response came exactly 1 week after Ralph's letter arrived. I found it in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning, a thick envelope with the return address of a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was a 6-page document that read like a declaration of war wrapped in legal jargon. The HOA's attorney had crafted a masterpiece of aggressive posturing. They acknowledged receipt of our correspondence and respectfully disagreed with our interpretation of property jurisdiction. According to their legal analysis, my property fell within the geographic service area of Sycamore Glen, and decades of community integration, including my father's fine payments, established a binding relationship between the King property and the HOA. The letter concluded by informing me that my original fine had been increased to $2,000 due to continued non-compliance, and that failure to pay within 30 days would result in a lien being filed against my property. I read it twice to make sure I understood what they were claiming. They weren't arguing facts anymore. They were burying me in language designed to sound authoritative while saying nothing of substance. Geographic service area wasn't a legal term. It was something their lawyer had invented to avoid admitting that the actual boundary maps excluded my land entirely. Community integration was an even more creative fiction, as if my father writing a few checks meant our family had somehow volunteered to surrender rights we'd held since before Pearl Harbor. This wasn't a legal argument. It was a bluff dressed up in expensive stationery. The question was whether they actually believed it or whether they were simply counting on me to fold under pressure. The second attack came 3 days later, and this one wasn't through lawyers. I learned about it from a neighbor I'd never spoken to, a woman named Patricia who lived 2 streets over in the subdivision. She stopped her car at the edge of my property while I was working on the cabin and rolled down her window with an expression caught somewhere between curiosity and concern. "You're the one building that cabin, aren't you?" I nodded. She hesitated. "I thought you should know Diane sent an email to the whole neighborhood about you. She didn't use your name, but everyone knows who she meant." Patricia pulled out her phone and showed me the screen. The subject line read, "Protecting our community standards." The body of the email described an outside property owner who was flagrantly violating construction regulations and refusing to cooperate with reasonable requests. It warned residents that unchecked non-compliance could lead to declining property values and encouraged anyone with concerns to contact the board. Diane had turned me into a threat without ever saying my name. I thanked Patricia for letting me know and watched her drive away, standing alone on my property. I could feel something shifting in the air around me. This wasn't about a cabin anymore. Diane was waging a campaign to turn my neighbors against me, to isolate me socially before she moved in legally. If enough people believed I was a troublemaker, no one would question when she filed that lien. No one would ask whether she actually had the authority to do it. They'd just see a man who refused to follow the rules and assume he got what he deserved. I'd watched this playbook before, not in person, but in stories from others who had faced similar situations. The HOA isolates the target first, makes them a pariah, then moves in for the kill, while everyone else looks the other way. Why do people like Diane do this? I asked myself that question as I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sun drop behind the tree line. The answer, I realized, wasn't complicated. Power, control, the intoxicating feeling of being the one who decides what's allowed and what isn't. She had run Sycamore Glen unchallenged for 8 years. She had sent fines and demands and watched people pay without question. My letter wasn't just a legal challenge, it was a direct attack on her authority. If I won, every resident in the neighborhood might start asking whether the rules they'd been following actually applied to them. The entire structure of her little kingdom depended on no one ever pushing back. I was pushing back, and she was going to make an example of me. A knock at my door around 7 interrupted my thoughts. I opened it to find an older man I vaguely recognized from the neighborhood, white hair, weathered face, the kind of hands that suggested he'd done real work at some point in his life. "I'm Walter Jennings," he said. "I live over on Maple. Have been there since '89. Mind if I come in?" I stepped aside and let him pass. He looked around my living room with the careful eyes of someone taking inventory, then settled into a chair without waiting to be offered one. "I've been watching what's happening with you and Diane," he said. "I remember your great-grandfather. Remember when they built this whole neighborhood around his property because he wouldn't sell. Stubborn old man. But I respected him for it." He paused. "I don't much like what she's doing to you. If you ever need someone to say what they remember, I'm willing." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a voicemail notification from an unknown number. I played it on the speaker. Diane's voice filled the room, smooth and measured. "Mr. King, I believe we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. I'd like to propose a meeting to discuss a peaceful resolution to this situation. I'm sure we can find common ground if we approach this as neighbors rather than adversaries. Please, call me back at your earliest convenience." The message ended. Walter snorted. "Peaceful resolution? That woman doesn't know the meaning of the word." I saved the voicemail and looked at the old man sitting in my living room. He was the first person from Sycamore Glen to offer me anything other than a fine or a threat. I called Ralph that night and told him about the lawyer's letter, the increased fine, the neighborhood email, and Diane's sudden interest in peaceful resolution. He listened in silence, then spoke carefully. "They're scared. That letter hit harder than they expected. Now they're throwing everything at the wall, legal threats, social pressure, fake olive branches hoping something makes you back down." He paused. "The lien threat is real. If they file it, it clouds your title until this is resolved. But filing a lien on property they have no jurisdiction over, that's actionable. We could countersue for slander of title." I asked him what our next move should be. "We keep building our case, and I think it's time we requested access to some HOA records. If they've been doing this to you, they've probably been doing it to others. Let's find out how deep this goes." Ralph's paralegal was a young woman named Jessica who had a talent for finding things people didn't want found. 2 weeks after our last conversation, she called me with news that made me pull my truck over to the side of the road just to process what I was hearing. She had been digging through archived records at the county planning office documents from Sycamore Development Corporation, dating back to 1985 and 86, before the first house in the neighborhood was ever built. What she found changed everything. The development company had approached Samuel King in the spring of 1985 with an offer to purchase his 3 acres. The correspondence was in the file, 3 separate letters, each one increasing the offer, $10,000, then $25,000, then $50,000. My great-grandfather had rejected every single one, and the final letter from the company's attorney acknowledged his refusal and stated that development will proceed on adjacent parcels only. They had known from the very beginning that King's land was not part of their project. They had designed the entire neighborhood around it because they had no choice. But that wasn't the discovery that made me pull over. Jessica had also found the original site plan from 1986, the one submitted to the county for approval before construction began. She emailed me a scanned copy while we were still on the phone. I opened it on my phone and zoomed in on the section where my property should have been. There, in bold letters printed across our 3 acres, were 4 words: private property, not part of development. The developer hadn't known we weren't included. They had formally documented it in their official filings. Every planning commissioner who approved Sycamore Glen in 1986 had seen those words. Every county official who reviewed the project understood that King's land was separate. This wasn't ambiguous. This wasn't a gray area. It was black and white, printed on paper that had been sitting in a filing cabinet for nearly 40 years. Stop for a second. This is important. The original developer knew Jonathan's land wasn't part of the project. They put it in writing, they filed it with the county. Everyone involved in building Sycamore Glen understood that the King property was separate. So, here's the question. If the developer knew, why has every HOA board since then pretended otherwise? Were they all ignorant of their own founding documents, or did they know the truth and choose to ignore it? Think about that, because the answer is coming, and it's worse than you might expect. Ralph called me into his office 2 days later. When I arrived, Jessica was there too, standing next to a table covered in documents I hadn't seen before. "We filed a formal request for HOA records under North Carolina property law," Ralph explained. "They're required to provide access to meeting minutes, financial records, and internal correspondence to any affected property owner. Diane tried to delay, but we got a court order." He gestured toward the table. "This is what they didn't want us to see." The stack included years of board meeting minutes, financial statements, and internal memos between board members. Most of it was routine budget discussions, maintenance schedules, complaints about parking violations, but buried in the pile from 2003 was a single document that made my blood run cold. It was a memo addressed to the HOA board, marked "Confidential for internal use only." The subject line read, "King Property Jurisdiction Status." I picked it up and read it slowly, making sure I understood every word. The memo acknowledged that the King property was technically not under HOA jurisdiction, based on original development boundaries and absence of covenant attachment. It noted that previous owners had paid fines without dispute, and recommended that the board continue current approach as long as no formal challenge was raised. The reasoning was spelled out clearly: pursuing formal annexation would require King consent, which was unlikely to be granted, and acknowledging the error publicly could undermine board authority on other matters. The memo was signed by the board president at the time, a man named Richard Hoffman, and countersigned by a board member whose name I recognized immediately, Diane Prescott. She had known for over 20 years. She had known that my family's property wasn't under her jurisdiction. She had signed a document confirming it, and she had continued sending fines anyway, betting that no one would ever dig deep enough to find the truth. This wasn't a misunderstanding or an overzealous interpretation of ambiguous rules. This was deliberate, systematic, calculated. My father hadn't been paying legitimate fines. He'd been extorted by people who knew they had no legal right to a single dollar. I sat in Ralph's office for a long time after finishing the memo, just staring at the signature at the bottom. Diane Prescott, 2003. She had built her entire career on the HOA board, knowing that at least one property was being improperly assessed. How many others were there? How many people in Sycamore Glen had paid fines they didn't owe because they trusted that the person in charge was acting in good faith? Ralph let me process in silence, then spoke quietly. With this document, we're not just defending your right to build a cabin, we're exposing a pattern of knowing misconduct. If you want, we can request an emergency HOA meeting and present everything publicly. North Carolina law requires them to hold one if an affected property owner submits a valid complaint. I looked at the memo one more time, then I looked at Ralph. Schedule the meeting. I want every resident in that neighborhood to see what their board has been hiding. He nodded and reached for his phone. They won't make it easy. Diane will try to control the narrative, stack the room with her supporters, maybe even cancel at the last minute. I stood up and gathered the documents carefully. Let her try. I've got 40 years of evidence and a great-grandfather who told me never to let anyone take this land. She's run out of places to hide. The night before the meeting, I went back to the lockbox one last time. I had been through it dozens of times by now, but something told me there was more to find. My great-grandfather had been a meticulous man, the kind who kept receipts for purchases he made in 1947. A man like that didn't just write a single note about refusing to sell his land. I spread everything across the kitchen table and started sorting through papers I'd only glanced at before: old tax documents, handwritten ledgers, faded photographs of people whose names I didn't know, and then, tucked inside an envelope marked Sycamore, I found it. A letter from Sycamore Development Corporation, dated September 1985, their final offer to purchase the 3 acres. The company president had written a personal note at the bottom. Mr. Bean, Mr. King, this is our best and final offer. I urge you to consider the benefits of selling now, before development begins and your property becomes surrounded by our community. My great-grandfather had written his response directly on the letter in pencil, never bothering to send it. Benefits: you want to buy my grandfather's land so you can put up cheap houses around it. No deal, not now, not ever. See, King. Below that, in smaller letters, this ground isn't for sale. Whoever reads this next, remember that. I held that letter for a long time. His handwriting was faded but firm. He had known exactly what they were trying to do, and he had told them no in words that still carried weight 40 years later. Walter Jennings came by the next morning to help organize the presentation materials. He brought coffee and a folder of his own photographs from the late 80s showing the construction of Sycamore Glen. In one image, you could see my great-grandfather's original cabin, standing alone in a field, surrounded by bulldozers and half-finished houses. I took this from my backyard in '89, Walter said. First year I moved here, everyone knew that the cabin was here before anything else. Some of the old-timers used to joke that the whole neighborhood was built around one stubborn old man who wouldn't budge. He set the photo on the table. I want you to show this tonight. Let them see what this place looked like before Diane Prescott decided she was in charge. Ralph arrived in the afternoon with a projector and a carefully organized presentation. We walked through the sequence one final time, not to convince ourselves, but to anticipate how Diane would try to spin it. "She'll interrupt early," Ralph said. "She'll try to discredit the documents as outdated or taken out of context. She'll appeal to emotion talk about community standards, property values, the greater good." He closed his laptop. "Don't engage with any of it. Just keep presenting. Let the evidence speak." Easy for him to say. He wasn't the one who would be standing in front of 80 strangers, accusing their leader of 20 years of fraud. "One more thing," Ralph said as we finished packing up. "I spoke with a few other residents while preparing for this. Turns out you're not the only one who's had questions about HOA jurisdiction. There's a woman on Cedar Lane whose property predates the development. She bought it from a farmer in '72. And a retired couple on Oak Street whose deed includes an easement that the HOA has been ignoring for decades." He paused. "If tonight goes well, you might not be fighting alone much longer." I hadn't expected that. I had assumed I was the only one stubborn enough to challenge Diane Prescott, but maybe stubbornness was more common in Sycamore Glen than she realized. That evening, I lay out everything on the kitchen table and stared at it. The deed, the site plan, the memo, the photograph, the letter with Samuel King's handwriting. It looked like enough, it felt like enough, but there was a difference between having evidence and convincing a room full of people who had trusted Diane for 8 years. Some of them had paid fines without question. Some had reported their neighbors for minor violations. They had invested in the system she had built. Asking them to believe it was rotten meant asking them to admit they had been fooled. That was a harder sell than any legal argument. Walter called around 7 to wish me luck. "Nervous?" he asked. I told him I was. "Good," he said. "Means you understand what's at stake. Your great-grandfather wasn't nervous when he told those developers no. He was certain. But you're not fighting for yourself tonight. You're fighting to change how those people see their own community. That's harder." He was quiet for a moment. "Just tell the truth. Show them what you found, and let them decide who they want to believe." I walked outside and stood in front of the cabin as the last light faded. The frame was almost complete now, walls up, roof on, windows waiting to be installed. It looked like a building again instead of a skeleton. Tomorrow night, I will walk into a room full of strangers and tell them that the woman running their neighborhood had been lying to them for years. Some would believe me, some wouldn't. Some would probably hate me for it, regardless of the evidence. But I kept thinking about that photograph Walter had given me, 1989. My great-grandfather's cabin stood alone while bulldozers tore up the fields around it. He had watched an entire neighborhood rise up around his land and never flinched, never sold, never compromised. And when they couldn't buy him out, they built around him because that was the only option he gave them. Tomorrow, I would find out if his stubbornness had been inherited by anyone besides me. The Sycamore Glen Community Center was a beige building with fluorescent lights and rows of metal folding chairs that squeaked every time someone shifted their weight. By 7 o'clock, nearly 80 residents had packed into the main hall, more than had attended any HOA meeting in the past 5 years. According to Walter, word had spread that something was happening tonight, and curiosity had drawn people who normally couldn't be bothered to show up for budget discussions and parking complaints. Diane Prescott sat at a long table at the front of the room, flanked by 3 other board members. She wore a cream-colored blazer and the kind of composed expression that suggested she had already decided how this evening would end. When I walked in with Ralph and Walter, her eyes followed us to our seats in the front row, but she didn't acknowledge us directly. The meeting opened with standard business approval of minutes, a treasurer's report, a brief discussion about replacing the pool fence. Diane moved through each item efficiently, her voice calm and measured. She was establishing normalcy, reminding everyone in the room that she was in control, that this was her domain. When she finally turned to new business, her tone shifted almost imperceptibly. "We've received a formal complaint from a property owner requesting time to address the board. As required by our bylaws, we're granting that request tonight." She looked directly at me for the first time. "Mr. King, you have 15 minutes. Ralph had warned me she would try to limit our time. We had prepared accordingly. I stood and walked to the front of the room, carrying a folder and a flash drive. Gerald Finch, the compliance officer who had photographed my cabin that first day, was operating the projector. He didn't look happy about it, but Ralph had made clear that refusing to provide basic equipment would look like obstruction. I plugged in the flash drive and turned to face the audience. 80 faces stared back at me, some curious, some skeptical, A few are openly hostile. I recognize Patricia from her car window conversation. I saw the woman from Cedar Lane that Ralph had mentioned, sitting near the back with her arms crossed. Walter gave me a small nod from his seat. "My name is Jonathan King," I began. "My family has owned 3 acres of land adjacent to this neighborhood since 1943, 44 years before Sycamore Glen existed. I'm here tonight because for the past 2 decades, this HOA has been sending fines and threats to my family for violations of rules we never agreed to follow, on property that was never under your jurisdiction." And the murmuring started immediately. I clicked to the first slide, the original site plan from 1986, with "private property, not part of development," clearly visible across my family's land. This is the document that Sycamore Development Corporation filed with Wake County when they built this neighborhood. They knew our land wasn't part of the project. They designed around us because my great-grandfather refused to sell. I moved through the evidence quickly, not explaining more than necessary. The audience could read. They could see dates. The 1989 photograph from Walter drew a few gasps, the original cabin standing alone, while construction swarmed around it. When I reached the 2003 memo, I paused. This document was obtained through a court order after the HOA initially refused to provide access to their records. I let that sink in. It's an internal memo confirming that the board knew that King property was not under HOA jurisdiction. It recommended continuing to collect fines anyway, as long as no one challenged them. I clicked to the final slide, showing the signatures at the bottom. The memo was signed by the board president at the time, and countersigned by a board member who is still with us tonight. I turned to look at Diane. "Mrs. Prescott, would you like to explain your signature?" The room went silent. Diane's composure cracked for just a moment, a flicker of something behind her eyes that might have been fear. Then she straightened in her chair and spoke in an almost steady voice. "That document is being taken out of context. The board was simply noting a technical ambiguity in jurisdiction boundaries. We have always acted in the best interest of this community." A man in the middle of the room stood up, cutting her off. "Did you know his property wasn't part of the HOA or not? Yes or no?" Diane hesitated. That hesitation was all anyone needed. The room erupted. Look at this moment. For 8 years, Diane Prescott ran this neighborhood without question. She sent fines. She made rules. She expected everyone to fall in line. And now she's sitting there, silent, while 80 of her neighbors realize they've been lied to. This is what happens when one person refuses to back down. When evidence speaks louder than authority. When a community finally decides to ask questions instead of just paying the bill. Jonathan didn't win by being louder. He won by being right. The questions came fast after that. If they knew about King, what else did they know? How many of us have been paying fines we didn't owe? I want to see those boundary maps for my property. The woman from Cedar Lane stood up and announced that her land also predated the development. The retired couple from Oak Street demanded an explanation for why the HOA had been ignoring their easement rights for 15 years. What had started as one man's complaint was becoming something larger, a collective awakening that Diane couldn't stop, no matter how many times she called for order. A motion was raised from the floor, an immediate audit of all HOA financial records and jurisdictional decisions for the past 20 years. The vote wasn't even close. Another motion followed, a vote of no confidence in the current board president. Diane saw what was coming and didn't wait for the count. She stood, gathered her papers with hands that weren't quite steady, and spoke into the microphone one final time. "I am resigning from my position as president of the Sycamore Glen Homeowners Association, effective immediately. I wish the community well." She walked out of the room without looking at anyone. No one asked her to stay. I found Walter afterward in the parking lot, leaning against his truck with a satisfied expression. "That was something," he said. "Haven't seen this neighborhood wake up like that in 30 years. I shook his hand. "Couldn't have done it without that photograph." He shrugged. I just took a picture. You did the rest." He climbed into his truck and paused before closing the door. "Your great-grandfather would have enjoyed tonight. He always did like watching bullies get what was coming to them." He drove off, leaving me standing alone under the streetlights. The cabin was waiting for me when I got home, dark and quiet, framed against the stars. Tomorrow, there would be paperwork refund claims, official acknowledgments, and probably more meetings. But tonight, for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. 3 months later, the check arrived. $4,200, every fine the King family had paid to the Sycamore Glen HOA over the past 2 decades. Refunded in full. The new board had voted unanimously to return the money after the audit confirmed what the 2003 memo had already made clear. The HOA had been collecting payments from a property they had no jurisdiction over, and they had known it the entire time. I deposited the check and put the receipt in the lockbox alongside my great-grandfather's letters. It felt right to keep them together, proof that stubbornness, properly applied, could outlast any bureaucracy. Diane Prescott's house went on the market 6 weeks after her resignation. I heard she moved to a retirement community somewhere near Charlotte, though no one seemed to know the details, and fewer people seemed to care. The woman who had controlled Sycamore Glen for 8 years had become a name people mentioned in passing, if they mentioned her at all. The neighborhood moved on with the quiet efficiency of a system correcting itself. A new board was elected younger residents, mostly, people who had been uncomfortable with Diane's leadership but hadn't known how to challenge it until someone showed them it was possible. They implemented transparency measures, open financial records, clear boundary documentation, and a formal process for questioning jurisdiction. Small changes, but meaningful ones. The cabin was finished in late October, just as the leaves began to turn. 400 square feet of honest craftsmanship, built on the same foundation my great-grandfather had laid down in 1945. I installed the last window on a Saturday afternoon, then stood back and looked at what I had created. The wood was fresh and pale, not yet weathered by Carolina seasons, but the bones were true. Every joint fitted the way my grandfather had taught me. Every beam was placed where it needed to be. I had rebuilt something that had sheltered 4 generations of kings, and if I had done my job right, it would shelter 4 more after I was gone. I made a small plaque from a piece of oak I had saved from the original cabin, one of the few boards that hadn't rotted through. I carved the words carefully, taking my time. King Cabin, Est, 1945, rebuilt 24. Below that, smaller, "This ground isn't for sale." I mounted it beside the front door, where anyone approaching would see it first. A statement and a warning, all in one. The neighbors started coming around after that. Not many at first, just Patricia, who had warned me about Diane's email campaign, and the retired couple from Oak Street, who wanted to thank me for speaking up about easement rights. But, gradually, others followed. People I had never spoken to would stop by while I was working in the yard, introduce themselves, and ask about the cabin's history. Some of them had lived in Sycamore Glen for years without knowing that a family had owned this land since before the neighborhood existed. They were curious about Samuel King, about the developer's failed attempts to buy him out, about the photograph Walter had shown at the meeting. The story had become part of the community's identity, the tale of the stubborn old man who had refused to sell, and the great-grandson who had refused to be bullied. Walter came by on a Sunday afternoon in early November, carrying a small frame wrapped in brown paper. "Found this cleaning out my garage," he said, handing it to me. "Thought you might want it." I unwrapped it carefully. Inside the frame was a photograph I had never seen before, black and white, slightly faded, showing a man standing in front of a cabin that looked almost exactly like the one I had just finished building. The man was smiling, one hand resting on the doorframe, squinting slightly against the sun. On the back, someone had written in pencil, "Samuel King, summer 1960. My great-grandfather, younger than I had ever imagined him, but with the same stubborn set to his jaw that I recognized from my own reflection." "Where did you get this?" I asked. Walter shrugged. "The previous owner of my house left a box of old photographs in the attic. Most of them were strangers, but I recognized your property in the background and held on to it. Figured someday someone would want it." I looked at the image again, Samuel King, standing on ground he had fought to protect, in front of a cabin he had built with his own hands. He couldn't have known that 64 years later, his great-grandson would be standing in the same spot, looking at the same view, carrying on the same fight. But somehow, I think he would have expected it. I hung the photograph inside the cabin, on the wall facing the front door, first thing anyone would see when they walked in. A reminder of where this all started and why it mattered. That evening, I sat on the cabin's small porch as the sun dropped below the tree line. The houses of Sycamore Glen stretched out around me in every direction, rows of similar rooftops, similar yards. similar mailboxes. They had been built to be identical, part of a planned community designed for efficiency and profit. But right in the middle of all that sameness was this place. 3 acres that had refused to conform, a cabin that had stood while everything around it changed, a family that had said no when everyone expected them to say yes. Diane Prescott had called my property an eyesore. She had tried to fine it into submission, to paperwork it out of existence. She had counted on me being like my father, quiet, conflict-averse, willing to pay a small price for peace. What she hadn't understood was that some things aren't about money or convenience or fitting in. Some things are about honoring the people who came before you, about keeping promises you made to men who aren't alive to hear you keep them, about standing on the ground that your great-grandfather refused to sell, and knowing that you would have made the same choice. The stars came out slowly, the way they always do in autumn. I thought about Samuel King watching the same sky, on this same ground, 8 decades ago. He had built something that lasted. He had drawn a line that held, and now, because of him, I was sitting in a cabin that would stand for another 80 years, on land that would never be sold. Thank you, I said quietly, to no one and everyone. I understand now.